Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading to Granada, specifically the really captivating Albaysian neighborhood.
Ah, yes, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Amazing place.
It really is. It's just this incredible example of medieval urban planning, mainly from the Nasrid period. So, what, 13th to 15th centuries?
That's right. When you're there, I
Yeah.
mean, the way the layout is preserved, those winding streets, the little squares, it feels like stepping back in time. It's quite remarkable.
Absolutely. And, we have a listener who brought up something really thought-provoking about it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they mentioned hearing that the Aldacians' design might stem from Levantine cities, like, say, Damascus, in its early influential period.
Interesting idea.
But their gut feeling and looking around pointed more towards North Africa, especially Morocco. And their big question, which I think is fascinating, is if Andalusian architecture really came from the Levant, why don't we see those kinds of, Albaysian style or Alhambra style landmarks in the big Levantine cities today?
That is a great question. It really gets to the heart of how influences travel or don't.
Exactly. So our mission today is to dig into that. We're exploring the urban and architectural roots of the Albaysian, weighing the evidence for Levantine versus North African influence.
And we've got a couple of sources to help us unpack this. One's an older piece from 41 comparing Damascus and Granada, and another analysis specifically looking at this question, Andalusian architecture, Levant or Morocco.
Right. So let's start maybe with that early Levantine connection. How strong was it, really?
Well, okay, context first. The Muslim conquest of Iberia starts way back in 711 AD, and it was initially led by the Umayyads, whose capital was Damascus. So,
Yeah.
yeah, there's definitely an early link.
Okay, so Damascus was the center of power then. You'd expect some influence to flow from there.
You would, and some cultural exchange certainly happened across the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
But as our listener pointed out, the question is about direct architectural or urban planning blueprints, especially for the Albaycin, which really took shape much later under the Nasrids.
Right, so how much did that early Umayyad Damascus-centered period actually shape the physical structure of the Albaysian centuries down the line?
That's the key thing,
Wow.
because while the Levant was part of that initial cultural sphere, the connections between Al-Andalus, Muslim Iberia, and North Africa became incredibly strong and just endured for centuries.
Yeah.
Much more sustained, really.
Okay, so let's talk about those North African ties then, because that seems crucial to the listener's point.
Absolutely crucial. You have Berber groups involved very early on, around 1013, for instance. Berbers took control in the Granada area, and they actually moved the main settlement from Elvira up onto the Albaysian hill.
Ah, so the actual location choice has North African roots?
Seems like it, yeah. They saw the strategic value of the hill. And then in the 11th century, you get the Zirid dynasty. There were Berbers from what's now Algeria ruling Granada. That really solidified North African influence.
Okay, so that's early foundational stuff.
And it doesn't stop there. Later, you have the big empires, the Almoravids and the Almohads. Their capitals were in Marrakesh in Morocco. And they controlled Al-Andalus for long stretches. Huge influence, political and cultural.
Right, so we're talking about repeated long-term dominance and interaction, not just a single event.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
wave after wave of connection. And even when we get to the Nasrids themselves in Granada, the last Muslim kingdom, they had really close ties, diplomatic, trade, probably cultural exchange with the Marinids in Fez, Morocco, and other North African states.
So this continuous back and forth across the Strait of Gibraltar. It just makes sense that ideas about how to build cities and design buildings would travel easily.
It creates a very strong potential, yes.
Hmm.
A shared cultural and architectural sphere in many ways.
Which brings us back to the Albaysian itself. What does its physical structure, its streets and buildings, tell us?
Well, the layout you see today, that dense maze of narrow, winding streets, the small squares, that's largely the Nasrid era footprint. But it wasn't built on nothing,
It had history already.
definitely. Back in the 11th century, under those Zirid rulers we mentioned, it was already a major Muslim quarter. It even had the royal palace before the Alhambra was built up.
Hmm.
And it was walled, fortified.
So, layers of history with that North African Zirid influence already present early on. And it's amazing how that basic street plan survived the Reconquista in 1492 and everything that came after.
It really is resilient. Our listener mentioned random buildings and narrow streets. But it's not random at all. It's an established urban form that just worked and persisted even as populations changed.
Okay, and what about the buildings themselves, the houses?
The classic Albaycin house is the Carmen. It's typically a freestanding house, whitewashed walls, and crucially, it has its own private garden or orchard space enclosed within its walls.
The Carmen. And that name itself is revealing, right?
Yes, it comes straight from Arabic karm, which means vineyard or orchard. So the Islamic origin and that connection between the house and its private green space is baked right into the name.
And inside. Courtyards.
Often, yes. Internal courtyards are a very common feature, providing that private, inward-looking focus for family life. It's a theme you see across many Islamic architectural traditions, but the Carmen with its integrated garden feels quite specific.
And there was infrastructure supporting all this too, wasn't there? Water must have been key on that hill.
Absolutely essential. The al-Baishan has this incredible network of underground cisterns, the al-Jibes. Some date back to the 11th century Zirid period. They were vital for storing and supplying water. The Al-Jabal del Rey is huge, the largest medieval one still there.
Wow. And you mentioned recent findings.
Yeah, archaeology keeps revealing things. For a while, people thought many houses were built later by the Moriscos after the Reconquista. But recent studies show many are actually Nasrid-era houses that were just renovated or modified.
So continuity, people kept building in the same ways, using the same basic structures.
Exactly. It points to a strong, continuous building tradition, deeply rooted in that Islamic and potentially heavily North African-influenced past.
Okay, so the al-Baishan itself seems to have this strong internal logic pointing towards that Andalusian North African sphere. Now, let's do the comparison our listener asked for. Let's look east to the Levant. Baghdad first, founded 8th century.
Right, Baghdad. Totally different story initially. It was planned meticulously as the Abbasid capital. A perfect round city, concentric walls, streets laid out symmetrically, very geometric.
Like a statement piece.
Pretty much, an administrative and military center. And interestingly, the original design didn't really feature public recreational spaces. So compared to the al-Baishan growing organically on a hillside, it's night and day, really.
So not much similarity there in the basic urban concept. No wonder our listener didn't see Alhambra vibes in Baghdad. What about Damascus? Much older city.
Much older, yeah. 3rd millennium BC roots. It had a Roman grid plan underneath it all, which influenced its structure over centuries. It has amazing Islamic landmarks like the Great Mosque from the 8th century, the Citadel.
The core layout.
The core layout still reflects that underlying grid, even with later adaptations. Courtyard houses became common later, especially in the Ottoman era, but the fundamental street pattern is different from the al-Baishan's organic, almost maze-like feel. Again, it supports the listener's observation: distinct history, distinct form.
Okay. Jerusalem. Even more complex, maybe.
Absolutely complex. Jerusalem's urban form is so deeply shaped by its immense religious significance for 3 major faiths. There isn't one single medieval plan dominating everything. You have distinct quarters, layers of history, walls rebuilt by the Ottomans. Its development was driven by religious and political factors very different from Granada's.
So comparing it directly to the al-Baishan is difficult because their reasons for being, their historical paths, were just so different.
Precisely. You wouldn't expect to find the same kind of residential or palatial architecture dominating.
Cairo, founded 10th century, another huge Islamic center.
Cairo started as a planned royal enclosure, al-Qahira, under the Fatimids. Square, walled. It definitely developed narrow streets later, good for airflow, and courtyard houses became common, and it's packed with incredible mosques and madrasas.
But different from Granada.
Different in its origins, that initial planned square, and just the sheer scale of its monumental architecture. Again, it developed differently from the al-Baishan's more gradual terrain-influenced growth, so the lack of specific Andalusian architectural echoes makes sense.
And finally, Medina.
Medina's urban form is almost entirely defined by its religious role, specifically the Prophet's Mosque. It wasn't really a major city before Islam. Its growth radiated from the mosque. Defensive walls came much later. Its significance is overwhelmingly sacred.
So, again, a unique case, not really comparable in terms of urban planning influences for a place like the al-Baishan.
Right. So if we look at the Levant overall, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Medina, yes, you see some shared features like narrow streets or courtyard houses, which are common in hot climates and Islamic societies. But the fundamental urban planning, the overall character, the specific architectural language, it's mostly quite distinct from the al-Baishan.
Which really backs up the listener's intuition that the primary source for the al-Baishan's specific feel might lie elsewhere.
It does seem to point that way.
Okay, so now let's cross the Mediterranean, mentally at least, and look at Morocco. This is where the listener suspected the stronger connection lies. Let's start with Fez.
Fez, Founded late 8th century, its old city, Fez al-Bali, is just this incredible, sprawling, organically developed Medina. Think labyrinthine alleys, narrow and winding, courtyard houses, the whole thing enclosed by walls with grand gates.
Okay, wait. Labyrinthine alleys, narrow, winding, walled courtyard houses. That sounds...
That sounds remarkably like the description of the Albaytian, doesn't it? The urban texture, the feel of the parallels are immediately striking.
Yeah, much closer already than the Levantine examples. What about Marrakesh? Founded 11th century.
Marrakesh, another imperial capital. Again, a large medieval Medina, maybe a bit more irregular in plan than Fez initially. Famous square, Jima el-Flana, mosques, madrasas. And architecturally, you have the Riad.
The Riad, like the Carmen.
Very similar concept. It's a traditional house focused inward on a courtyard, but specifically a courtyard with a central garden. That emphasis on the cooling, private green space within the home, it's a very strong parallel to the Albaytian's Carmen. Plus, Marrakesh has those distinctive red earth walls.
Wow. So Fez gives us the urban layout similarity. Marrakesh adds that specific house with garden parallel. Rabat.
Rabat's interesting. Founded mid-12th century as a fortress, its Medina developed from there. But the really key thing for Rabat is what happened in the 17th century.
What was that?
A huge influx of Andalusian refugees, Moriscos expelled from Spain after the Reconquista, settled there. They basically revitalized parts of the city and had a massive impact on its culture, architecture, music, everything.
So a direct demographic link. People carrying Andalusian traditions back to Morocco.
Exactly. It shows that flow of influence wasn't just one way and highlights that shared cultural world across the strait. Shared urban ideas were part of that.
Okay, and Meknes, another imperial city.
And Meknes has its great monuments, mostly from a bit later, the 17th century, under Moulay Ismail. But it has its Medina, impressive ramparts, and its style is often explicitly called Hispano-Moorish.
Acknowledging the link.
Right. It blends those Islamic traditions with European influences, much like you see in Al-Andalus. So even though its main phase is slightly later, the architectural language and the presence of the Medina reinforce this picture of shared urban and architectural characteristics between Morocco and Andalusia.
It's pretty convincing. Comparing the Albaytian to Fez, Marrakesh, Rabat, Meknes, the similarities seem much deeper and more specific than with the Levantine cities. The organic growth, the narrow streets, the courtyard houses, the walled nature.
Yeah.
It just resonates much more strongly.
It really does. And this isn't just, superficial resemblance. Academic work backs this up.
Oh yeah, what does the scholarship say?
Well, scholars often talk about a distinct architectural tradition in the Islamic West, meaning Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, North Africa. They see it as developing somewhat differently from the traditions in the Eastern Islamic lands, like the Levant or Persia.
So a recognized regional style.
Yes, and they point specifically to the influence of North African dynasties, like the Almoravids and Almohads we mentioned, on Andalusian architecture. Even the Nasrid style of the Alhambra and Albaysheen is sometimes seen as a kind of refinement or reaction against the more austere Almohad style, which, again, came from North Africa.
So influence flowed both ways, but the North African impact on Granada was direct and profound.
Extremely. That whole concept of Moorish architecture really embodies this blend, incorporating North African Berber traditions alongside Arab Islamic ones and local Iberian elements. Scholars highlight those visual parallels, the twisty streets, whitewashed walls in Andalusia and Morocco, even specific decorative features like muqarnas, those honeycomb vaults.
Yeah, you see those in the Alhambra?
Exactly. Their development is closely tied between North Africa and Al-Andalus. There's debate about exactly where certain innovations started, but the connection is undeniable. The general consensus really supports this idea of a very strong, very long-lasting architectural and urban conversation happening across the Strait of Gibraltar.
Okay, so let's circle back directly to our listener's question then. Why don't we see Albaytian or Alhambra lookalikes in major Levantine cities?
Based on everything we've looked at, it seems the answer lies in those different historical paths and connections. While, yes, the initial Islamic influence in Spain had roots tracing back to the Umayyads in Damascus.
That was very early on.
Right, and the Albaytian, as it developed its defining character centuries later under the Zirids and especially the Nasrids, was just far more deeply and continuously connected politically, culturally, demographically with North Africa, particularly Morocco.
The sustained, geographically close relationship mattered more for the final form.
It appears so. The architectural ideas, the urban planning models that shaped the Albaysheen seem to have come predominantly from, and been shared with, that Maghrebi sphere, rather than directly from the more distant Levant. which was on its own historical trajectory.
And features like the Carmen, which feel so quintessentially Granadan, actually fit perfectly within that shared Hispano-Maghrebi tradition.
Exactly. It reflects shared solutions to climate, social norms, and aesthetic preferences that developed in that Western Mediterranean Islamic world.
So bringing it all together, the evidence really suggests that while the Levant connection was part of the early history, the Albacene's distinctive urban fabric and architecture owe much more to that long, close relationship with North Africa, especially Morocco.
It paints a picture of a dynamic regional sphere where ideas flowed back and forth across the strait, creating a unique, shared architectural heritage distinct from the Eastern Islamic world.
It really does. This has been a fascinating deep dive. It certainly makes you appreciate the Albaycene in perhaps a slightly different light, understanding those deep connections across the water.
It underscores how history and geography shape culture in really profound ways.
Absolutely. And it leaves you wondering, perhaps, what other pieces of common knowledge about historical or cultural origins might actually be more complex and nuanced if you really dig into them. Something to think about. Thanks for joining us.